All right, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me perfectly now. I'm just sharing some slides. Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lotta Virtima. I'm a project officer at Ocean Energy Europe, responsible for ETIP Ocean, the European Technology and Innovation Platform for Ocean Energy that aims at promoting ocean energy on its way to industrial rollout. And today's webinar is on decommissioning bonds for ocean energy projects. We have two very interesting presentations coming up, but just some housekeeping before that. So we will have a Q&A during the webinar as well. So you can write any questions during the presentations or after in the questions box on the right side of your screen. And we'll take them after the presentations then. Normally, I would say that you can find the recording and the presentation slides on our website, etipocean.eu, but our website was located in a data center that burned down a couple of weeks ago, and we're still working on getting it back up. So unfortunately, it's not available at the moment, but hopefully in the coming days. So I will put the recording and the presentations there. But if you do need the slides and recording already this week, don't hesitate to send me an email. You can see my email address on the slide there, and if you doubt your ability to type my last name right, you can also contact the info@etipocean.eu, and you will reach me through there as well. So don't hesitate, I can transfer you the slides and the recording, that's no problem. So today's webinar topic is decommissioning bonds, and for those of you for whom this is a new topic, a decommissioning bond is a financial guarantee that makes sure that a site used for an ocean energy project or any project can be returned to its natural state at the end of the project. So that's what we're talking about today. Decommissioning bonds are very important for any offshore renewable projects, and there are special considerations to take into account for ocean energy pre-commercial and demonstration projects. So installations, as I said, need to be removed after the project, and at the same time, it should not pose any risk or as low as possible, a financial burden that would threaten a project viability. So in this webinar, we have two experts from two different test sites today to share their experience on decommissioning and how to balance the risk and reward. And with that, I would like to introduce John Skews from European Marine Energy Centre, EMAC, from Scotland. John Skews is the operations and maintenance manager, and I think EMAC has a lot of experiences on this topic. So John Skews, very happy to welcome you here. I will very quickly give you the presenter rights so you can start sharing your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bear with me, guys. Okay, can we all see that?
It's loading now. No, perfect.
Great, okay. Well, hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Skews. I'm the Operations and Maintenance Manager for EMAC, the European Marine Energy Centre. I'm responsible for keeping our Orkney-based wave and tidal test sites open to developers, including getting devices onto the site and their removal at the end of the test period. I've worked for EMAC since 2012 and with several tidal developers prior to that. The focus today is really decommissioning, and the important part that plays in the commercial viability of not only a project but of the industry as a whole. So a very quick piece of background information on EMEC. So EMEC established in 2003 in the waters around Orkney, off the north coast of Scotland, United Kingdom. We are blessed with decent tidal flows and also very good wave resource there as well. So the wave site was opened in 2004, which is a connected wave test site, followed in 2006 by the tidal test site, again grid connected. So over a decade of experience, EMEC has attracted developers from all around the globe to prove really what is achievable in some of the harshest marine environments. We've seen 32 devices, 20 developers from 11 countries. To date, more wave and tidal devices have been grid connected at EMEC than any other site in the world. And from that follows that we've also amassed a huge amount of experience and knowledge about the challenges of decommissioning. At present, we've got 4 decommissioning projects live across the two sites. So really, as an introduction, I want to talk about the learning curve, the changes we've seen to licensing, the practical aspects of decommissioning. I think the goal overall is we need to manage the risk, ultimately to make the sector more investable. But since the establishment of EMEC, one of our objectives has been to provide a testbed for learning to support the development and growth of the marine renewables industry. It's been a steep learning curve and is likely to continue that way. A learning curve really about operating a test site, and also about a learning curve with regards to devices and getting successful devices tested and proved. Decommissioning from a developer perspective and also the ongoing operation test site has been a constant part of that learning curve. It's not always been smooth. There have been some fairly major mistakes along the way, some of which we're still living with. We have had an experienced changes to policy, particularly in the last couple of years, with regards to the approach to decommission assets. Ultimately, the goal is to manage and, where possible, decommission the risk involved around getting our kit out of the water, getting your kit out of the water. If we can do this, this will make the sector more attractive to investors. The issue we've got, I guess, is decommissioning is it's not a sexy part of the project. We're all fired up at the beginning. We've got a device. We know it's going to work. We know we need to get it in the water. We're going to get it in the water. I think when we come to decommissioning at the end of that project, there's normally 2 possible scenarios. The first one is that it's been successful, and device has performed. We got it in the water. We took it out of the water. We took the device out of the water. What we want to do now is focus on moving forward, getting on to the next device, commercializing this one. The last thing we want to think about is actually getting the site clear, getting any kind of foundation removed. The other option, or the other scenario really, is that we've had a failure with the project, and either that can be some kind of equipment failure, or even just a project funding failure, and that does leave the question: who's going to clean up? And this is where we're seeing the recent move to decommissioning bonds and securities coming into play. So recent government policies and changes are requiring now that financial security is in place to cover the decommissioning. I think up until recently, that's never really been pushed. and we're certainly seeing that it is our. So if we take a very quick look at the guidance, and this is particularly as regards to the UK and Scotland. There we go. So the main change we've seen through the guidance is that the responsibility for managing and ensuring decommissioning takes place has changed, certainly in the UK, from the UK government to the Scottish government. And one of the big issues here is that Scottish ministers may require a person who is responsible for these installations to prepare and eventually carry out a costed decommissioning programme. Now, this is for commercial marine renewables projects and also for test marine renewables projects. And when we say may require, you can read that as they do, they're going to require it. All of this is in the Offshore Renewables Energy Decommissioning Guide. And then if we look at the test centre specifics, again, big push is that tenants must produce an acceptable decommissioning plan. So it's not necessarily the operator of the test site, it's the tenants. So yourselves, the developers coming in here. And not only must we produce a acceptable test plan, then appropriate financial security should be in place. Now, it's this appropriate financial security which is difficult. The industry is in its infancy, so there are very few benchmarks that really exist. And secondly, the security needs to be signed off by government departments, certainly here in Scotland, and government departments are traditionally very risk averse. And lastly, all of this needs to be done before deployment. But the last thing people tend to think about is when they're pushing to get a device in the water is paperwork, decommissioning plans, getting them all in place. But we've certainly seen, from a licensing point of view, a very strong push to make sure that this is happening. Again, more so now than in the future, in the past. So we talk about stages in the guidance. Stages 1 really through to 4 are under our control. So that's the control of the site operators and site developers. And normally, certainly at EMAC, we'd expect to carry out this detailed work in 4 to 8 weeks. And that includes consultation with any stakeholders. So from our point of view, it'll be the MCA, NLB, people like that. And then stage 5 to 6, and this is where we're seeing the delays. This is when we put, we or you put the submission in to the licensing body. In our case, it's Marine Scotland. And to date, we're seeing 6 months plus, potentially longer. And a lot of this is around the financing, and it's whether or not the government ministers and government departments are actually accepting the bond providers as being an acceptable risk. Again, it's a big issue here that this is all new. Everything is new to us. We're not mainstream. People don't like risk. It's the old adage that banks and insurance companies will only cover people that don't actually need it. There are no silver bullet answers to this that will easily satisfy all of these requirements. We've seen some developers being asked for detailed plans and not being able to receive a license before it's in place. Other developers with maybe a bit more experience, they've been allowed to deploy, but with a condition that they put a bond in place. So it is by no means clear at the moment. So I think really the challenge we've all got is how do we make decommissioning marine energy equipment mainstream? And there are two answers to that really. One is we remove the risk as far as possible. secondly is we commercialize the whole operation, the whole product, so that even with decommissioning liabilities, it becomes an attractive opposition for investors. To do that on a practical scale, we need to answer the questions: is decommissioning an afterthought? And what we've seen over the years at EMEC is that it's not an afterthought. We've seen some very slick, successful decommissioning operations carried out. Devices removed, structures removed, seabed surveyed, absolutely clean. You would hardly know that anything had been there, which is the ultimate aim in this. However, we've also seen experience where little consideration has been given to how we get the kit off the seabed and clean up. This is an illustration here. This is a piled tripod arrangement. A couple of very easy things that could have been done at the design stage that weren't, which made the decommissioning potentially dangerous to carry out and also very expensive. One was that just purely no real thought had been given to how this was going to be cut up subsea. So that we ended up, or the result was we ended up using divers at one stage, which is the last thing I want to see on any of the sites. And then when we were able to use diamond wire cutting kit, we ended up again having to cut away a lot of equipment just to get the cutting kit in. So with a bit of thought at the design stage, all of this equipment that needed cutting away could have been placed elsewhere. We could have had lifting lugs put onto the various sections. So again, we'd have gone down with an ROV and threaded a cable through rather than sending a diver down. So it's very important to get all this sorted out. To think about physically how we're going to do it, what we're going to use to do it, what tooling is required, what vessels. Again, you'll know yourselves. If we can do this using multi-cats, small multi-cats, then we're on a £5,000 or £6,000 day rate. If we're using heavy lift DB ships, then we're tens of thousands of pounds. And the last one is debris recovery. What we have found is that there's a huge amount over a 3 or 4 year project. A huge amount of debris ends up around the periphery of the site. Bits of cable, lifting strops, shackles, and again, we spent days surveying the sites and going back and picking up all these bits and pieces. All of this adds cost. But again, lots of relatively small items on the practical side that make a massive difference to the end result. So I think in conclusion, what we need to do is design commissioning in right at the start. It will eventually save money and time, and also if you're going to your licensing authorities with a realistic plan, well, not only licensing authorities, if you're going to your bond providers with a thought out, reasoned approach to decommissioning, then the cost of that bond is going to come down. If you go to your licensing authority again with that reasoned argument, you're going to be looked on more favourably. The process is going to be quicker, and they're more likely to accept your bond. So design commissioning in at the beginning, design the risk out, and the last thing I want to see on my sites are divers. And they can be not necessary, and they should be not necessary. So that's a huge piece of work there. And all this would design the cost out. And ultimately what that does, if we design the cost out at this stage, as we move forward to commercialization, we make the long-term projects and the bigger projects more profitable. And if they're more profitable, people are more likely to invest in them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I think that was a very interesting conclusion, an important one as well, on how you need to think about the decommissioning in different areas like technology, so that you can really reduce those costs at the end of the project. So we're long-term thinking there as well. Okay, we will move on to the second speaker, Tony Wright, now, who is the Marine Operations Director at Fundy Ocean Research Center for Energy. So Tony thank you for joining us here from Canada, Nova Scotia. Good morning. I think it's morning there at your side. So thanks for joining, and the floor is yours.
Okay, Lana, thank you very much. John, thanks for your presentation. Really informative. And in some respect, I'm happy to see that in Scotland, it's not all figured out, because in Canada, it's not all figured out either. And I'm really happy that we're having this discussion, because it's a hot button topic for us in Canada at the moment, particularly the aftermath of Cape Sharp or Open Hydro's experience here in the Bay of Fundy, and how we kind of learn from that and move on. Because, you know, we have this interest, this dual competing interest of protecting the public interest with respect to these projects, making sure they're done properly. But at the same time, you know, I think we all want marine renewables to progress. And if it's too expensive, you know, it will never happen. And so the decommissioning aspect of this is a big function of the cost of the project. Anyway, so I've got a quick presentation to give Lotta. It's just a couple of slides. I just want to overview FORCE and maybe strike what the difference between FORCE and EMEC is. We're not necessarily a single device test site. Our developers are mostly looking at longer term commercial projects. And so there's a little bit of a twist on the decommissioning security side of it there. And then the last part of the presentation, I really want to cover off, you know, our lessons learned, our observations with respect to Cape Sharp's project here in the Bay of Fundy at FORCE. So I'll try and share my screen here, just bear with me. Is that coming through okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So FORCE, first of all, is a not-for-profit company that was started in 2009 with the intent of developing the potential for in-stream tidal energy in Nova Scotia. So with a combination of funding from Canada's federal government, the provincial government, and private sector partners that were looking to demonstrate that FORCE, FORCE created a test site really with the dual role of providing a facility or being a host to developers to demonstrate small-scale commercial arrays now at FORCE. And FORCE's other role is really to act as a steward over the whole undertaking, to ensure that the regulatory process is adhered to, the right approvals are in place. We promote research related to the development of in-stream tidal energy, particularly around the environmental monitoring side of it these days. And then to report publicly on the results of what we do. Because right now, the development of marine renewable energy, particularly in Canada, is heavily reliant on public investment to make these projects go forward. And so really fundamental to our mission is trying to understand what conditions, you know, what conditions that will drive the development of marine renewable energy, particularly in-stream tidal, and what extent can Nova Scotia rely on tidal energy to play a critical role in its future energy mix. And to do that, we're going to need to do a couple of things. One is to make sure that the technology is safe for the environment, that it can coexist with other users of the ocean, fishers, First Nation, and that it's viable. And part of the viable is not just the reliability of the device, but it's also that the cost of this electricity comes down in a predictable format, so make it attractive for ratepayers as an option to consider when we look at the future energy mix of the province. Okay. I'm not sure how to advance my screen here. One sec.
I think I can see an arrow at the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Sorry, I'm using a Mac for the first time, so bear with me. I hope it works out okay. Anyway, you know, Nova Scotia is not the only area of interest for marine renewables. Canada broadly is interested in understanding the potential for marine renewables, particularly the generation of wave electricity, river current, which is similar to tidal, and then tidal. It gets easily to say right now the focus is on the development of the Bay of Fundy opportunity. And what I guess the point here is that while there's a lot of interest, it's been a slow start. And I think the slow start is a function that in Canada, there's a lot of other competing options at the moment, other low cost energy sources, low carbon energy sources, lots of other renewable sources. And when that's compared to marine renewables as an option, I think the decision's easy to go with the other potential sources of electricity generation. But there's still an interest to develop marine renewables. It has a long-term, benefit for the country for sure. It does have a role. And there's also a regulatory challenge though, because of there's a jurisdictional issue in Canada between the federal government and provincial government. And so that's played out in the offshore oil and gas sector, but it hasn't played out quite yet with respect to offshore renewables. There's also regulatory challenges around how to permit these projects from an environmental consent perspective. And so that's tending to slow down the pace of the project. And I find with respect to overall regulation of the sector, offshore oil and gas is not a good template to follow for marine renewables. And so we're kind of needing to write the playbook as we go forward with respect to how this sector gets regulated. And that's slowing down progress. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have not seen wider adoption of marine renewables in Canada to date. It's just because it's taking time to get it right. And the regulatory process around the development of the sector, part of which is this decommissioning and security issue, it's taking longer than we'd like to see. Okay, so experience today in Nova Scotia, really our focus is almost entirely on in-stream tidal energy. We've been at this for quite some time. Starting in 2009, Open Hydro, in partnership with our utility, Nova Scotia Power Incorporated, deployed a 1 megawatt device uncabled at the Force site. That was retrieved successfully in 2010, and it was really what set the possibility that in-stream tidal could really be a thing in Nova Scotia. Force was created shortly after that, and in 2016, after receiving a berth in 2014, Open Hydro deployed its first turbine. A US company, Big Moon Power, in and around that time, also tested an unconnected device in the Minas Passage. In 2018, Open Hydro deployed a second device at the site, and now presently Sustainable Marine Energy is working in Grand Passage and is actively looking at bringing their project into the Force site. Okay, so why Nova Scotia? A couple of reasons. One, we have this fantastic resource in the Bay of Fundy. It's one of the best tidal resources in the world. But coupled with that, Atlantic Canada and Nova Scotia particularly has a need for renewable energy. Today, the electricity mix in Nova Scotia is still about 60% fossil fuel based. So we have a need to find other sources of renewable energy. And so Force was created to understand to what extent tidal could be one of those opportunities. In Bay of Fundy, the resource, as mentioned, one of the best in the world, highest tides. We see currents in the Minas Passage off of where Force is located, which is little dot there, about 20 kilometers an hour or 5.5 meters per second, sometimes up to 6. So it's, phenomenal current speeds. And it's estimated that through the course of the whole Minas Passage, there's an estimated 700 or 7,500 megawatt resource there, which far exceeds Atlantic Canada's peak demand. So the resource is phenomenal, but what makes it an interesting place for tidal energy also makes it a wickedly difficult place to work in, much the same as EMEC. Okay, so Force's assets, as part of our role as host, Force has built a 30 megawatt interconnection facility. There's 11 kilometers of subsea power cables installed at the site. We have 5 berths. There's a visitor center / operational center that plays host to the developers while they're conducting marine operations at the site. There's site data that's been collected that's made available to the developers, and there's permitted offshore berths. Really, the focus of the developer then is to make sure the other consents like navigable waters, environmental permitting are in place for the project, and then they're off to the races. Okay, so present layout at Force. Just could give a quick overview here. Berth, Bravo, and Echo here on the far left belong to DP Energy, two companies that they've created, Rio Fundo and Haligonia. They plan to deploy three turbines at each berth, three 1.5 Andrews turbines. Partnership between Minus Tidal and Sustainable Marine Energy Canada for berth Alpha and Charlie. The plan there foresees 9 megawatts of 4.6 kilowatt flat-height platforms to be installed. And then a new entrant to Force, at least, is Big Moon Power. They've recently acquired the rights to berth D. They're planning on installing the Kinetic Keel Gen 3, each device being a floating platform at 500 kilowatts. So the proposed layout at Force presently is for about 22 megawatts of permitted energy production using 3 different overall technologies, which will make the decommissioning and consenting process a little difficult, just because they're not the same technology. Essentially, each technology is going to have to be looked at a little differently. Okay, so now that we've kind of taken a look at Force, I just want to overview, Cape Sharp. So Cape Sharp was awarded a berth at the Fundy Ocean Research Center for Energy in 2014 and was an active developer at the site from 2015 to 2018. Cape Sharp was a joint venture between the regional power holding company, Amera, who holds our utility, Nova Scotia Power Inc., and Open Hydro. And so Open Hydro had an 80% share in the project, and Open Hydro at the time, or transitioned to become owned by Naval Energies at about 60%, I believe. So Open Hydro was majorly owned by Naval Energies through the duration, or at least the last half of the part of the project at Force. The Force project saw 4 megawatt commercial demonstration array to be developed. It would include 2 by 2 megawatt 16-meter turbines, as you can see in the picture here. The turbine, which you can see underslung from the Scotia Tide, which is the barge, weighed about 800 tons. So the overall device installed weighs about 1,100 tons. The turbines and the gravity base were designed to be installed with a custom barge called the Scotia Tide. So that was built during the construction of the 2 turbines. And both turbines were supposed to be connected to the Force subsea export cable via a hub assembly that was installed in 2015. Okay, so I just kind of created a timeline. I'm not going to go through all this today, but if anyone wants to kind of take a closer look at the timeline of Cape Sharp's project, I think this presentation will be up on the website. Namely, I just want to talk about a couple of key milestones here. First, November 2016, the first Open Hydro turbine was installed at the site after the hub and twin tail arrangement was installed in 2015. And we had successful energy production for a number of months through the winter of 2017. And in April, Cape Sharp attempted to recover that turbine, and then in June, eventually removed the turbine completely. And the year later, following that recovery, Cape Sharp led the successful installation of the second turbine at the site. And it was during that time that the province required a $1 million security bond to be placed for the installation. About 3 days after the turbine was installed at the site, Open Hydro was placed into liquidation. And so that created a bit of chaos around the project. It's something I want to talk about today, with the impact of a project going into liquidation while it's up and running. Because I think that plays into how the security gets set and what the provinces or regulators' reaction to dealing with that situation will eventually be. Because it took regulators and force quite some time to understand how to deal with the situation, and eventually the process in which we would remove the turbine, but also return the berth back to active service. That's another interest that force has, is that there's a lot of value tied up in the demonstration berth. So we don't necessarily want it back to its natural state, but we want it back to a point where the next commercial entity can come in and take over for the project. And so in November 2018, July 2018, Open Hydro was placed in receivership, which forced the whole Cape Sharp project into default very quickly. And then in November 2018, after trying to salvage the project, ultimately the Canadian project was abandoned. And then presently, last fall, Big Moon Power was awarded the rights to develop Berth D. Okay. So, I mean, this is the key part of the presentation. This is kind of like my personal views on some key takeaways from dealing with the Cape Sharp situation. And I keep coming back to thinking about, to what extent is Cape Sharp a unique situation? And the answer is yes. And is it unique? Yes and no. It's unique in the fact that its financing structure was entirely funded from within the project. And so there was no equity, there was no debt partner to step in and try and salvage the rights. The company, or Cape Open Hydro, was placed into liquidation immediately. And with that comes, like, the guillotine falls, and the email addresses of all the employees are cut. There's nobody left at Cape Sharp to answer the phone. There's nobody left at Cape Sharp to help turn off the turbine. There's nobody left at Cape Sharp to help figure out how to keep environmental monitoring it so that force doesn't lose its environmental consents. And so that kind of sudden, abrupt liquidation process really throws things into chaos for a period of time. The other, just going back to the unique situation for Cape Sharp, 16-meter turbines. I'm not sure if you can see the scale of that device relative to the cars in the background, but those are big, intimidating structures. Combined with the 800-ton gravity base underneath it, overall 1,100-ton marine lift is not a trivial undertaking, especially when we have currents, slack water periods that last maybe 30 minutes if we're lucky, with tides that exceed 5 meters per second. And so trying to recover that is a daunting task. And really, one could argue is the use of that special purpose recovery barge, the Scotia Tide, the only practical method to recover the turbine? My personal belief is that I think it is. And if you look towards other recovery methods, like bringing in a heavy lift ship, you're totally now into uncharted territory about whether that's safe or even viable way to recover something like this. And so in that respect, I think this is a unique situation. And regulators, when we encounter these unique situations, need to be particularly on guard to how are they going to be decommissioned properly, safely. The other aspect of the liquidation process, I think that needs to be, and this would probably be in the case with any receivership, or I think in the UK called administration, is that even if you have the recovery resources, you don't necessarily have the right to intervene to recover the turbine and to dispose of it if you want to. And so we're still trying to iron out regulators' authority to step in to basically turn a turbine off, make it safe, recover it because it's a navigational hazard, get it out of the water, and not be in violation of the rights of the creditors. And so that balance between creditors' rights, the trustee obligations, and the incentive for the province to kind of like return this project site back to normal as soon as possible so that it can meet its objectives of demonstrating title. There's a real balancing act there. And to the extent that government can impose regulations to give itself the right to be able to step in and not seize assets necessarily, but just get them out of the way and make them safe so that the industry can carry on, I think speaks to the public interest. The other issue is that, you know, as much as we want to see these projects be commercially viable, there's still a challenge with respect to, you know, connecting the dots to make sure that these projects make financial sense. Particularly, you know, that will come, but we need more projects in the water. And right now, you know, tidal energy projects are not great commercial investments. And because of that, you know, there's not a lot of interest out there for people to come in and buy a project. There's only a select few entities out there globally that, you know, have the resources, that have the ability to understand the value of what's left behind at Cape Sharp. You know, the power purchase agreement that's in place, the license to generate the electricity, the infrastructure at Force. You know, you've got to really know your game to understand that that's valuable. And so in the attempt to sell Open Hydro or sell the project at Force, it ran into that issue that there's just not a lot of ability and not a lot of investors willing to make that jump at the moment. When you now add in the requirement to remove the turbine, it basically becomes, you know, a very high risk financial move to do that. Okay, so as I mentioned previous, there was a $1 million security placed on the recovery, and that was drastically, the cost to decommission the project was drastically underestimated for a number of reasons. So, you know, $1 million would have been, I think, enough to recover the turbine should you have clear access to the Scotia Tide, that there was a short period of time between the liquidation and the actual removal process so that the barge, you know, stays in class, the equipment on the barge stays, you know, operational. When you're talking time period of 2 years, that all goes away, and now you need to kind of bring this Scotia Tide back to life if you can get access to it. And so even with the project, you know, abandoned, the status of the Scotia Tide, this unique barge to recover the turbine, the status of that was questionable. I mean, there was 5 creditors that had a lien on that barge that all needed to be satisfied before the barge could be sold to an entity that wanted to, you know, work with Big Moon Power to recover the turbine. That process, that juggling of interests, was you know, quite tiring, frankly, but ultimately got resolved. And so when regulators looks at the cost of the project, they need to consider these things. They need to consider, wait a sec, there's a chance this project could be just completely abandoned. We're going to have to lead the recovery somehow, or use the security to get someone else to do the recovery of this open hydro turbine. What's the cost of, you know, accessing the Scotia Tide, making sure it's in class to a suitable, you know, to a point where it can actually do the recovery? What's the cost of not only removing the turbine, but disposing of it? And in term, you know, between the actual recovering it and the disposal, who's going to pay for the wharfage fees, or wherever it's going to go? So that needs to be considered. And then you need to consider, how do you remove the balance of plant, which is, you know, in this case, quite significant. We have 2 turbine tails, and we have a Y connector that's placed on Force's cable. Now, some could argue that that's actually value added. I guess that depends on the viewpoint of the next developer that comes along. But the decommissioning scope needs to cover all this off. And, you know, this is not a slight to energy regulators at all, or those looking to develop natural resources, but you need pretty sophisticated marine experience to be able to go through the project to that extent and really approximate the costs that it would cost to recover the turbine if no open hydro resources are left behind, including some of the drawings that are required, like lift points of the turbine, you know, those types of things. Like it's really an undertaking, and I don't think that's been done properly to date, is to really examine the decommissioning requirements for some of these projects. The other thing that may be unique in Cape Sharp, maybe not sure, time will tell, is that a lot of the suppliers that would be involved in the decommissioning work, you know, have suffered are now actually creditors with respect to the Open Hydro project. And so getting that crew of expertise back to work on the recovery or the disposal, they want to be paid off for the money that they lost working with Cape Sharp before they start working on the project. So there's some serious negotiation that has to happen there with suppliers if you can't bring in other suppliers. And then there's an ethical issue. Should you bring in other suppliers if the ones that are, have been jaded by Cape Sharp, is that the right thing to do? Is that in the public interest of developing an economic opportunity? It's a good question. And then the last thing I want to mention is that the abandoned project like this really impacts public interests. So first and foremost, for an undertaking like Force, there's been a lot of public investment to get it going. As I mentioned right from the beginning, Force has been created with funding from both the federal government, provincial government, and the private sector. So there's a lot of interest to see it be successful. And these kinds of news articles that you see here don't help maintain that government or public interest well. The other thing is that, from a regulatory perspective, an environmental regulatory perspective, leaving an operating turbine running is not necessarily in the best interest of anybody. And so, how that impacts public interest for those that are concerned about the environmental risks of operating turbines. And so for a period of time around that, Force needed to step in and do environmental monitoring around the turbine. Because and there was even a point of when the decision was made to try to put the turbine in free spin, is it actually turning? Is it not? Who has the knowledge of the onshore control system to go in there and ascertain that? Can you do that from completely without using Cape Sharp's equipment? So what Force was charged with monitoring whether or not the actual device was turning, because that impacted our overall environmental consent for Force, which impacts the other 4 projects at the site. So I know I'm being a little long-winded here. I will move on. So I guess one of the things too is that it would be easy to say government or regulators, well, that's okay. We'll just command a very high security bond to deal with all these risks. But that's not the answer, because demanding those high security bonds to deal with all the stuff, all the issues I just highlighted, will never get projects in the water. And so there's this dual competing interest between safeguarding the public interests and setting the commissioning bonds, but also protecting the investment that's been made in building sites like EMEC and Force, so they continue to offer the service of demonstrating marine renewable energies. So regulators need to think about that, but they also need to think that there's got to be another way than purely commanding financial security, because that will never get us to where we need to be. First of all, it will never incent the demonstration or testing of devices. And secondly, it'll never bring down the cost of marine renewables to the point where it is competitive with other sources if we keep asking these high rates of security. So I am interested, I'm interested to hear John's perspective. I'm interested to hear some of the audience perspective on ways that we can safeguard public interest without asking for high security. And I've just thrown a couple of mitigating points for us to think about. One is that I think that a regulator in Nova Scotia and Canada right now for production of energy is the Department of Energy and Mines. The Department of Energy and Mines is not a marine-based expert, and so third-party expert advice when estimating the full scope of the recovery in different scenarios needs to be employed. And I think that goes a long way to addressing some of the public concerns that their interests are being protected, because at least now we have a starting point for what those costs are and an assessment about how unique a particular project is. Like if you look at this image on the left here, that's a unique energy project. It takes specialized skills to go in there and decommission something like this or recover a turbine. in an environment like force. And so that needs to be weighed into how you set the proper security. The other thing that is highly relevant is financial structure of the projects. You know, if and right now, and that was a unique function of Cape Sharp, I believe. Right now, we have 5 berth holders that are all relying on private equity and debt financing partners. Debt financiers will want step-in rights to try and intervene and step in and save the project. I think that's a good thing. We're not going to see the sudden liquidation like we saw with Cape Sharp. At least I don't think so. So I think that plays into it as well. The other thing is for regulators to have regulations embedded within legislation that give clear line of sight about their ability to step in and remove a turbine or a structure so that the site can be returned back to active production of marine renewables. So I think that's something that could be looked at. Regional infrastructure for decommissioning. So right now, when we go to remove it, when I say we, it's really now Big Moon's responsibility after requiring the rights to berth D. When Big Moon goes to recover the turbine, where do they put it? You know, are creditors going to intervene to prevent Big Moon from actually proceeding with the disposal of the asset? So this type of infrastructure that developers could rely on to kind of park assets while some of this legal stuff is figured out, I think is pretty critical. And that can be done in advance of any future project permitting. So I'm over time. Sorry about that, Lotta, but it's a real interesting subject, and I hope we can kind of continue to create like what are the issues, what are observations, and what are different regulators doing about it, because we got to get it right if we want marine renewables to be successful. That's it.
Thank you, Tony. In fact, thank you very much for the presentation. I didn't want to cut you off because I was very fascinated by the case study as well. Okay, so I let you go a little bit over time, but I would now like to bring John on the screen as well. We have a few minutes for a short discussion, and I wanted to just maybe bring up one theme that, well, you, Tony, touched in the end there as well. So because of the stage of the sector, it's still, you know, quite in the early stages in a way, and it might be difficult to get all the investors on board, and especially if you need to then have all the money for the decommissioning already before the project. So are there any ways or mechanisms that could help that? Because many ocean energy developers also are SMEs, so they're small companies and may not have that resource in-house either. So in order to secure the funding for the decommissioning, but not asking it up front, could there be kind of, I don't know, monthly allocation of money on a decommissioning bond or any other mechanisms that could help that from that side in a way? I don't know if I'm explaining myself well, but any ideas or thoughts on that would be welcome. John or Tony?
Okay, I'll go first. I forgot to mute my mic, so it's on. Sorry, John. So I think the financial innovation around the security, absolutely, like this is not my wheelhouse at all. I think that that's actually a good thing to think about. But you know, our experience, and I know everything's clouded with this Cape Sharp experience that we have at the site, is that if we wanted to have a monthly payment type arrangement for security, like you never know when when the hammer is going to fall, and it's sudden and vicious with no insight. Like who would have thought Naval Energies would have pulled financing out of open hydro 2 days after the turbine was installed, and they were undergoing the commissioning process for the turbine. Like it was about to start producing electricity. It was about to start making 53-cent kilowatt hours, and they pulled the project. Like no one could have foreseen that. So I'm not sure. I think, you know, my sense is that the financial security needs to be up front, but there are mitigating things. What I really like what John was saying is that during the design of the structure, you can start thinking about easier ways to decommission that. And if you can go to your regulator and say, look, we've thought about this, here's what we're doing, here's how we're going to decommission it ourselves, these are the exact method statements, and give those to the province to hold in confidence. That then gives the province at least some know-how or the ability to hire third-party people to come in and go, okay, here's how we will decommission this as affordably as possible. And that kind of work can be done up front before the permitting. I think that's our best option at the moment. But if people have ideas about innovative financial instruments that could be employed to protect the government's interest here for security, hey, I'm all ears to listen to that.
I think another potential is to again, looking at the funders and overall position with funders, is maybe a push for some collaboration between projects. And what we're seeing is we're seeing turbines and devices being put into the water, and then we're seeing separate projects running literally a kilometre away, looking at biofouling. And there's again we're seeing cross germination between wave and tidal and offshore wind at the moment, again particularly with the biofouling side of things. So if a project overall has got funding from lots of little baskets, then that will reduce the risk. So I think that would be an option that is worth investigating. What it does need is a bit of joined up thinking between again the regulators and the funders. And let's face it, at the moment, majority of funding is still public funding as opposed to private. So yeah, it is a way about being an innovative on the financing. I think in the past, we tend to be quite blinkered. It's our project. Nobody else is going to get a look in on this one. Is there a way you can share some of that risk and share some of the outcomes around as well? Just to move the whole. It's this thing about moving the industry forward. As individual groups, we need to move forward. Individual companies, researchers, we need to move forward. But unless we move the whole industry forward, we're not going to be here. So it's going to take some pretty out of the box thinking, I think, to get this going. Tony's right as well. I think the regulators cannot just say, okay, we're going to make it so difficult. We're not going to approve any kind of project unless there is a massive no risk to our security bond on it. That's not the way forward. And we operate in a very risky business at the moment. We're right at the cutting edge of technology and development, and unless we take that risk on collectively, then we're not going to go anywhere.
Yes, thank you. Tony, did you want to comment on that? We can still go a couple of minutes over time. One thing I was wondering about, I think one of you spoke about the difficulty to estimate the decommissioning costs, because that's something that's never done before. These are unique machines as well. So to what extent actually the budget can be assessed for the decommissioning already before? And is there ways how to improve that? Maybe learning from other projects, of course, but these technologies are quite unique. Maybe, I don't know, John, what you said about also collaborating with other projects.
But I think really to get clarity on the decommissioning costs, it comes back to this: design it at the beginning, think about it at the beginning, how are you going to do it, and break it down. Because the operations, I think, that need to be done are not necessarily completely new. But it's a case of thinking. It's putting it all together and thinking about how we are going to do it. Tony is right away in that the way to decommission the open hydro project is with that barge. So in the decommissioning plan somewhere, and again, a regulatory plan somewhere, that needed to be almost ring fenced as an asset.
Yeah, for sure. That's probably the biggest issue that we were facing for a while there, with Scotia Tides under marine arrest by 5 different companies. Even if the province wanted to pay for access to it, you need to go through a court process just to get the creditors on board. There's a cost to that. These creditors have lost a lot of money, so they're just not willing to take $1.50 to get their lien off the barge. And so that needs to be thought about before the open hydro project is even permitted. Not saying it can't happen. And the other thing that we're finding, Bay of Fundy is not the North Sea. We don't have tremendous access to offshore heavy lift vessels. We have some, but the main marine service provider in Canada was one of the creditors. And so if you want quick and ready access to a heavy lift, anchor handler to go in and operate Scotia Tide, and that creditor's owed $2 million, they're not going to be really motivated to help you out until they get paid off. So that delays this issue as well. So this is why I'm a huge advocate. Third-party marine experts need to be brought in to look at these issues before the license or the consent to deploy ever happens. Because I think they would have the idea that, yeah, we can't use that anchor handler, but I know of one over here that's possible, and I know those day rates. And it's that type of information that needs to be built into what the security needs to look like.
Thanks. I know we're over time, but we just got in a few more questions, so I'll quickly go through them and then we will wrap up. So here's a question: as another mechanism to remove the financial bond placed on developers, have test sites explored the option of a decommissioning type insurance similar to wreck removal, which is already required by developers?
We haven't heard, but
yeah.
my just knowing what it takes to cover some of these things, that the cost of the insurance would be the same as the decommissioning bond. But generally at this stage, and trying to get an underwriter to understand the scope of what's being proposed is very difficult. So I just give you an example. When Force went to market to try and insure our subsea power cables, the annual cost of the coverage for subsea power cables is $300,000, with a caveat that it won't insure any perils due to environmental risk. So what's the point? So I don't know if insurance is ready to respond to this particular situation. That's my gut feel. Maybe it is, and maybe that needs to be looked at. It's a good point. I like it.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tony. It needs looking at them. I mean, we did a similar exercise for our scale sites and seeing if we could get an overall policy that would take that burden off of the really small guys. And we just got no leeway or track with the insurers. And again, it's difficult. I think it comes down to lack of experience, and somewhere along the line we've got to get that experience and get people out there to recognise it. And I think again that's going to be a joint. Nobody as an individual, no individual test centre is going to do that. No individual developer is going to be doing that. We need to be doing that as an industry to get that confidence in place.
Thanks. I'm just moving on to the next question. I think John talked about this a bit before. Had developers in North America or Europe considered a syndicate or mutual fund to cover decommissioning risk and costs? John, I think you mentioned that at some point.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a way forward. Let's say almost some kind of mutual society arrangement where everybody chips in. It's certainly worth investigating.
And I have 2 more questions that we'll wrap up. So here's a participant who thinks that the the key may be ensuring developers have properly scoped the decommissioning process and costed it. And you mentioned the vessel requirements are still unclear, for example, HLV. Can you say any more on that? I'm not sure if this is for Tony or John now, but any thoughts?
So I mentioned the issue of HLV with respect to recovery of an open hydro turbine. I guess I'm not writing. I wouldn't. I've learned now after working in the sector for 8 years that that there's many ways to approach a problem. The way you think it's right is not the only way it's right. But a heavy lift ship working in a tidal environment where the flows change, every 6 hours, knowing how a heavy lift ship works, the time it takes to lift 1,000 tons off the seabed, and then not having the detailed knowledge of where the structural lift points are for that lift, I'm just not sure we could ever get an HLV company to come in and take that risk. Like, if I was a captain, I wouldn't want to do it until I have detailed knowledge and engineering assessment of how that lift is going to happen. And right now, that information, the turbine wasn't designed with those lift points in mind. So the risk would be you get halfway through a lift and then you become stuck out there. And now you've got a turbine and an HLV that need to be decommissioned.
Yeah, exactly.
The worst case scenario. I mean,
yeah.
But I just want to make the point that in these wicked tidal environments, you got to be really careful because you could get stuck. Being stuck halfway through a heavy lift and the tide changes would be really a disaster. It would be a huge risk to life. And so you got to think of those things as you kind of look at these other options. And that's why I say that I think an HLV would be a very tricky undertaking.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. You're talking about work windows of minutes in some situations, and that just doesn't give you doesn't give you a fallback position.
Indeed, and the last question is, not really related, but let's see what you say. So you often see the assumption that decommissioning is simply the reverse of the installation. How realistic is that? I'll let you, John, go first.
Yeah, no, I think it's very unrealistic. For all sorts of reasons. The kit's been in the water for a certain amount of time. You've got all sorts of fatigue issues to potentially deal with. You've got marine growth to deal with. Just purely the weight of the structure coming out after a couple of years is significantly different. It's not a. I see method statements. People have run out of steam by the end, and it just says reverse of install. That doesn't get much further than the black bag under the desk. Yeah, it's not the same process.
Tony, you want to comment on that?
I just
agree.
I totally agree. Yeah, it needs to be looked at under a different lens entirely. Yeah. With how do you do that work without even having access to the same marine assets that were used for the deployment? And so you got to start with a fresh sheet of paper on that one. And just the other thing it's not just the cost of the bond as well. I want to say that even if, so demanding higher and higher security is not necessarily the answer, because for us, and if I look at this Cape Sharp situation, the cost was underestimated, but also the uncertainty about accessing the assets. Like, how do you resolve that? And even today, we don't even know for sure, once that turbine gets recovered, are the creditors going to step in and do something that drive the costs up even higher for the company that took the undertaking to remove it? And so it's defining some of these things about the right to remove and decommission in advance, and while addressing creditor rights, is a zero cost undertaking that I think regulators need to think about. What precautions can they put in place to make that process smooth? Because as John pointed out, it could be like the length of time between the project going into liquidation and the recovery could be, my experience with liquidation is nothing happens fast, we're talking 2-3 years between liquidation and recovery. And in that intervening time, everything falls out of class, everything falls out of certification, and now you're starting from scratch. So if you can shorten that window up, you're going to reduce the salvage costs for sure. So I'm a big advocate that that's just a paper exercise. Well, I'm trivializing it because it's legal work, right? It's legislation that needs to be enacted to be able to get in there and remove these things, at least for these nascent marine renewable energy projects. You know, once this industry is mature, it's commercially viable, this is not required. It's not required in offshore wind at the moment. Like, this is just something that's an issue for us today while we're having these first projects hit the water.
Like I said, a very quick example of the practical side of that is, like, I've got a twin piled test structure on one of the sites, and it's part of the open hydro. It used to be open hydro. Navigation lights. So I'm still, I don't know who owns it. We're still running power out to it to power navigation lights. When that power goes down, I have to send somebody out to board a structure that we don't own to get the lights going again. Purely because, from my point of view, the risk is greater to me, ourselves and our site of not having those navigation lights on, and it is an unknown, and that's an issue, because at some stage it will fail completely.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think with that, we will end the webinar. Sorry for going a little bit over time, but I certainly have learned a lot, and I think one of the big takeaways really is to take decommissioning already into consideration in the design of the technology already, because that can really reduce the decommissioning costs as well. And as Tony highlighted, regulators need to also be involved and have that kind of better involvement, let's say, in this, so we can kind of make sure that those bad experiences do not happen again. Of course, it was, I mean, these are complex issues. Okay. Thank you, Tony and John, for your presentations. And as I said, the recording will be on the website once it's up again. And if you need the slides before that, you can just send me an email. Thank you for participating. Thank you to our audience today, and I wish you a very nice rest of the day. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Lada. It was great.
Great.